Dipesh Chakrabarty's Provincializing Europe, Postcolonial Thought and Historical Difference, 2000, stands as one of the most influential works in postcolonial theory and subaltern studies. It profoundly challenges the universalist assumptions of European Enlightenment thought and its pervasive influence on global historical narratives. Chakrabarty, an Indian historian and a key figure in the Subaltern Studies collective, argues that European modernity has been positioned as both the origin and the universal model of history, progress, rationality, and politics. The book calls for a rethinking of how histories of non-Western societies are written, urging scholars to provincialize Europe, that is, to situate Europe as one province among many, rather than the center or measure of all human experience. 1. The central argument, decentering Europe. Chakrabarty's main thesis is that the intellectual frameworks developed in Europe, particularly those of the Enlightenment, have been treated as universally applicable, shaping disciplines like history, economics, and political science. Concepts such as modernity, democracy, capitalism, and secularism are seen as products of a particular European trajectory, but have been exported globally as if they were inevitable stages of all human development. Chakrabarty insists that these categories are deeply rooted in specific European histories and therefore cannot simply be transplanted elsewhere without distortion. The book's provocative title, Provincializing Europe, encapsulates its goal, to deconstruct the Eurocentric assumption that Europe represents the normative endpoint of world history. To provincialize does not mean to reject or dismiss European thought, rather, it involves recognizing its limits and contextuality. It requires an epistemological shift, acknowledging that the European experience is one among many possible human experiences, not the universal template for all. 2. History 1 and History 2, the coexistence of modernity and difference. One of Chakrabarty's most significant theoretical contributions is his distinction between History 1 and History 2. History 1 refers to the universalizing logic of capital, as articulated by Marx and other European thinkers. It represents the historical narrative that assumes all societies move toward modernity, industrial capitalism, and rational governance. In this sense, History 1 is abstract, teleological, and oriented toward progress. History 2, in contrast, encompasses the plural and heterogeneous ways of being that resist or coexist with capitalist modernity. These are the local, cultural, and spiritual forms of life that persist within modern economies without being fully subsumed by them. For example, traditional social relations, religious practices, and forms of community continue to exist even within capitalist frameworks. Chakrabarty argues that any comprehensive understanding of post-colonial societies must account for both these histories. While History 1 dominates academic and political discourse, History 2 reveals the persistence of non-modern temporalities and subjectivities that challenge linear, Eurocentric historical models. This duality underscores that modernity is not a homogeneous global condition but a fractured and uneven experience. 3. The problem of historical universality. Chakrabarty critiques historicism, the belief that all societies evolve along a singular developmental trajectory that leads toward modernity. Historicism underpins both liberal and Marxist narratives, which regard Europe's history as the model that others must follow. According to this logic, nations like India are always catching up, lagging behind, or developing toward a European standard. Chakrabarty exposes the violence of this temporal ordering. It relegates non-European peoples to the waiting room of history, as if they exist in a pre-modern stage destined to be overtaken by Western progress. This metaphor captures the political and psychological consequences of Eurocentrism. It denies the contemporaneity of non-Western experiences, treating them as remnants of an earlier epoch rather than as coexistent modernities. For Chakrabarty, the task of postcolonial historiography is to write histories that acknowledge difference without subordinating it to the universalist time of Europe. This involves developing conceptual tools that can recognize the coexistence of multiple temporalities, modern and non-modern, within the same social world. 4. Rethinking the discipline of history. A major part of provincializing Europe is a reflection on the discipline of history itself. Historical scholarship, Chakrabarty argues, is built upon secular and rational foundations derived from European Enlightenment thought. The historian's task has traditionally been to explain events through cause and effect, human agency, and social structures, leaving little room for divine intervention, spirituality, or non-rational forms of experience. However, in many non-Western contexts, religion, myth, and metaphysics remain integral to people's understanding of the world. To exclude these dimensions from history writing is to misrepresent the lived experiences of postcolonial subjects. Chakrabarty therefore calls for an expanded conception of history that can accommodate the presence of the divine and the spiritual without reducing them to mere cultural symbols. In this way, he challenges the secular assumptions of Western historiography. By doing so, he does not advocate for abandoning rationality but for recognizing that rationality itself is culturally situated. The historian must be aware of the epistemological violence that occurs when Western categories are imposed upon non-Western experiences. 5. Marx, modernity, and the limits of universalism. Chakrabarty's engagement with Marx is central to his argument. While he acknowledges the analytical power of Marxist concepts in understanding capitalism, he also critiques Marx's implicit Eurocentrism. Marx's theory presupposes that capitalist relations will eventually dissolve all traditional forms of life, ushering in a universal modernity. But in post-colonial contexts like India, capitalism coexists with pre-capitalist social relations, such as caste hierarchies, kinship networks, and religious practices, that do not conform to this prediction. Chakrabarty therefore reads Marx against himself. He extracts from Marx the recognition of historical difference while questioning his universalist teleology. The challenge, Chakrabarty suggests, is not to abandon Marx but to provincialize him, to treat his thought as a product of a specific historical experience rather than a trans-historical truth. 6. The politics of the subaltern and post-colonial thought. Provincializing Europe builds upon the intellectual legacy of the subaltern studies group, which emerged in the 1980s to recover the agency of marginalized groups excluded from nationalist and colonial histories. While earlier historians focused on elites, the subaltern studies scholars sought to write history from below. Chakrabarty extends this project by interrogating the epistemological foundations of history itself. For him, it is not enough to include subaltern voices within existing frameworks, the frameworks themselves must be rethought. Post-colonial thought, in this sense, is both a critique of colonial domination and a philosophical inquiry into the conditions of knowledge. It asks how we can think about freedom, politics, and modernity without automatically referring back to European categories. 7. Provincializing Europe in practice, implications for global history. Chakrabarty's ideas have had profound implications for how historians and theorists approach global history. His concept of provincialization has inspired scholars to write histories that emphasize plurality, locality, and entanglement rather than linear progress. It has also influenced disciplines such as anthropology, political theory, and literary studies. By provincializing Europe, scholars can better appreciate the multiplicity of modernities. For example, Japanese, Indian, African, and Latin American modernities each develop unique syntheses of tradition and modern life. This approach undermines the binary opposition between modern and traditional, revealing instead a complex interplay between the two. Chakrabarty's work also resonates with decolonial thinkers in Latin America, such as Walter Mignolo and Aníbal Quijano, who critique the coloniality of power. Both traditions share a commitment to epistemic pluralism, the recognition that multiple ways of knowing coexist in the world. 8. Critiques and debates. While provincializing Europe is widely celebrated, it has also sparked debate. Critics argue that Chakrabarty's emphasis on the coexistence of History 1 and History 2 risks romanticizing difference or undermining the possibility of universal political projects. Others contend that his approach may lead to cultural relativism, making it difficult to formulate shared values such as human rights or democracy. Chakrabarty himself acknowledges this tension. He does not propose abandoning universals altogether but rethinking them as plural universals, values that emerge through dialogue among different cultural and historical experiences. This delicate balance between difference and universality remains one of the book's enduring challenges. 9. The broader philosophical context. Provincializing Europe engages deeply with European philosophers like Heidegger, Derrida, and Marx, but does so from a post-colonial perspective. Chakrabarty's method is one of critical appropriation. He takes European theory seriously while exposing its historical and geographical limits. The book also draws on Indian intellectual traditions and thinkers such as Rabindranath Tagore and Mahatma Gandhi, who offered alternative visions of modernity grounded in spiritual and ethical values. By juxtaposing these traditions, Chakrabarty opens up a global conversation about what it means to be modern. 10. Conclusion. The future of post-colonial historiography. Dipesh Chakrabarty's Provincializing Europe remains a landmark work that redefines how we think about history, modernity, and knowledge. It challenges scholars to write histories that recognize the plurality of human experience without subsuming it under European universals. To provincialize Europe is not to reject the Enlightenment but to situate it, to see its achievements and contradictions in their proper context. It is to acknowledge that modernity is not a single story but a network of overlapping and contested narratives. In a world increasingly shaped by globalization, migration, and cultural hybridity, Chakrabarty's message remains urgent. We must learn to think beyond the binaries of modern, traditional, West, non-West, and universal, particular. Only by doing so can we imagine a truly plural and decolonized human history, one in which Europe is not the measure of all things, but one voice among many in the ongoing story of humanity.